on. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing our first session. So we have three great speakers for the first session, and I'm so happy to introduce our first speaker, who is Clodagh Finn. Clodagh is a well-known journalist with the Irish Examiner, and she's also written a fabulous book called Through Her Eyes. And now she's going to introduce us to 6 historical women in STEM. Clodagh.
That's great. Una, thank you very much. I'm just trying to share my screen now. If you bear with me. Okay. Great. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning at the 9th annual Robert Boyle Summer School, which has put on a great lineup despite the difficulties of organising the events online. So bravo for that. But then I suppose that is entirely apt, as we will be talking over the next hour about creativity and ingenuity of women in STEM, past, present and future. In this session, we will be paying tribute to historical women in STEM, and very fittingly, it is dedicated to Mary Mulcahy, who you see here, who was a tireless champion of women's overlooked role in this arena. I particularly love this picture of her because her infectious enthusiasm shines through, and she brought that enthusiasm and curiosity to everything she did. She graduated with first-class honours in genetics from Trinity College, Dublin. She went on to do a master's in statistics and then worked in Tagus before turning to journalism. And it was in journalism that she really became a pioneer of science communication in Ireland, writing and broadcasting and organising walking tours. As she said herself, she was on a mission to tell everyone how ingenious Irish ideas have changed the world. And she was passionate about women in science and technology and sustainability. She was a founding member and the first chairperson of Women in Technology and Science in 1990. Her book, Ingenious Ireland, a county-by-county exploration of Irish mysteries and marvels, what a great title, made a big impact, and she was named Irish National Science and Technology Journalist of the Year in 2002 to 2003. One of her many achievements was ensuring that many notable Irish women of science and technology were not consigned to the footnotes of history. And I read about one of them, Ellen Hutchins, Ireland's first female botanist, in a book that was edited by Mary called Stars, Shells and Bluebells, Women Scientists and Pioneers. Unfortunately, there's no known portrait of Ellen, but many of her beautiful botanical art, as you see here on the left, do survive. Her story is remarkable in that it shows how one woman in the early 19th century managed to overcome so many obstacles to make a lasting contribution to the world of botany. That essay in the book that Mary edited, whetted my appetite to find out more about Ellen. And I was further drawn to her story when I read of her arduous carriage ride from Dublin to West Cork in the early 1800s, in a vivid short biography which was written by her niece, Alicia Maria Hutchins. The roads were so treacherous in places, she wrote, that men were sent ahead to fill the boggy potholes with furze bushes to allow safe passage. And I imagined this young woman, Ellen, leaving behind the distractions of the city to go to Ballylickey House in Bantry Bay. And there she was to care for her mother, an elderly grandaunt, Belle, who hadn't left her bedroom in 3 years, and also her invalided brother. And as well as that, she had her own ill health, and she was deeply upset by ongoing disputes between her brothers over the property. But despite all that, she emerged as an internationally acclaimed botanist. And we get a great insight into how she fared through the singular voice that survives in her letters. She describes how her daily burdens were offset by her joy in discovering botanical treasures in the previously unexplored environs of Bantry Bay. Her passion brought her to international attention, and it was her determination that made a lasting impression on me. She spoke about the world being light and full when she had time to botanize and visit her exquisite little beauties, as she put it, as she called the plants growing in the richly diverse habitats of Bantry Bay. In just 8 years of botanizing, she discovered many new species and made a lasting contribution to the understanding of seaweeds, mosses, and liverworts. She died very young, shortly before her 30th birthday, but she leaves behind a lasting legacy, and many of the plants she discovered bear her name. That brings me on to another woman of natural science who I think perhaps falls a little below the radar, and her name is Maud de Lapp, and she was a self-taught marine biologist and scientific pioneer, really ahead of her time. When she was 8, she and her family moved to Valentia Island, and as a child, there's a lovely picture of her and her sisters here exploring the diverse marine life that surrounded them. They took samples on the shore and they sent them off to the Natural History Museum in Dublin for further analysis. And in fact, those samples whetted the appetite, if you like, of the Royal Irish Academy, and they surveyed the island. They sent a team there in 1895 and 1896 to look at the samples that these ladies had found. Maud and her sister Constance's work collecting samples was also acknowledged in published papers, which was hugely significant for female scientists at the time. One of Maud's major contributions to marine science was her study of the life cycle of jellyfish, and she began conducting her own experiments on rearing jellyfish, and she was the first person to get them to breed successfully in captivity. She wrote a series of influential articles, and they were all authored under her own name, which really was quite unusual for a woman at the time. Her significant contributions to marine biology were recognized in her day, also like Ellen Hutchins, so that was something. And in 1906, she was offered a position in the Marine Biological Station at Plymouth. But her father, unfortunately, was having none of it. He said, "No daughter of mine will leave home except as a married woman." So she stayed in Valentia, but she continued her work and collected samples and studied them in her homemade lab. In 1928, she recorded a rare sea anemone, and that was named after her. It's called Edwardsia de Lappe. The researcher Thomas Allen Stevenson, who suggested the naming, said of her, "Miss de Lappe's skill and persistence in collecting rare species are indefatigable." That leads me to another indefatigable lady called Kathleen Lynsdale. She was born Kathleen Yardley in County Kildare in 1903, and she was the youngest of 10 children. Her parents separated when she was a child, and she went to Essex with her siblings and her mother. And I suppose she had very good opportunities there, which she may not have had in Ireland. And she excelled in school and went on to enter Bedford College, University of London, aged just 16, to read physics. And in 1922, she achieved the highest grades in the exams that had been seen at the university for 10 years. And as a result, she was invited to join Nobel physicist Professor William Bragg's research school. And there she collaborated with international science to produce the International Tables, or the Crystallographer's Bible. These were comprehensive tables for determining crystal structures. In 1929, she made her first major discovery. And while doing so, she solved a really important question that had been argued over for 60 years by scientists. Essentially, she demonstrated conclusively that the benzene ring was flat. She was also a woman who enjoyed many firsts. In May 1945, she became one of the first 2 women elected Fellow of the Royal Society, only 300 years after it was set up. A year later, she was appointed Reader in Crystallography at the University College in London. And in 1949, she became the first woman professor at the university. She was also the first woman president of the International Union of Crystallography. But she was also a woman who had many strings to her bow, and she was a committed pacifist. During World War II, she conscientiously objected to registering for the Civil Defence Service, and when she was fined £2, she refused to pay it and ended up spending a month in Holloway prison. And that marked her, and she spent a lot of the rest of her life campaigning for penal reform. She became president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she wrote a book in 1957 called Is Peace Possible? And like so many of the women that I'm talking about this morning, and we will be talking about, she also advocated for women in science. And she published instructions on the topic in 1970. And her first piece of advice was to choose a supportive husband, as she had. She married in 1927 Thomas Lonsdale, and he encouraged her to continue her scientific research. Unfortunately, Kay McNulty would not be so lucky. She did not enjoy the same support from her husband. And when she married John Moshley in 1948, he was a widower with 2 children. Apparently on the honeymoon, he presented her with a cookbook and said, "You are our new cook." All the same, the couple went on to have 5 children, and Kay would go on to earn the reputation as the Irish, in inverted commas, mother of computer programming. And just to backtrack a little, she was born in Donegal in 1921. She was an Irish speaker when the family emigrated to Pennsylvania in 1924. And I suppose, like Kathleen before her, she had educational opportunities there that she might have not had at home. At the time in Ireland, just 37% of Irish girls between 14 and 16 enrolled in school. But Kay went on to high school, and like the women we were talking about previously, she won a scholarship to Chestnut Hill College, and she graduated in 1942 with outstanding grades in maths. And her mother, if her husband didn't encourage her, her mother did. She said, "Do your best to prove that Irish immigrants could be as good, if not better, than anybody." During World War II, the US Army urgently needed mathematicians, and Kay was hired to calculate missile trajectories. And her official civil service title was computer. So she was a human computer. And she excelled at this work and was selected in 1945 with 5 other women to work as one of the first programmers of a top secret machine called the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, the ENIAC, at a military base in Maryland. And it was the world's first electronic general purpose computer. Mind you, even though these women did essential work, when the computer was publicly launched in 1946, the women were asked to be hostesses, and they were, seen to be pretty women by the computer. For much of her life, Kay's work wasn't acknowledged. But in 1997, that did come when she and the 5 other ENIAC women were inducted into the Women in Technology International Hall of Fame. And in 1999, a computer science prize in Kay's honour was established at Letterkenny IT. And that brings me to my final woman, called Gemma Redmond. And I hope that someday there will be a similar honour for Gemma Redmond from Tala in Dublin, a biotechnologist who was the first person to 3D print human tissue and keep it alive. Gemma had a vision, and she pushed to make it a reality against the odds. She once wrote, "Someone told me something couldn't be done, but lateral thinking and taking apart software has worked again. Hooray for me." She believed she could find a way to 3D print human organs so that she could heal herself along with millions of others facing a range of health issues from infertility to organ failure. In part, she was looking for a solution to her own medical problem. She found out she was infertile and she wanted to, in quotes, fix it. And she set about finding a way to 3D print ovaries, and a uterus. And she went on to develop a prototype bioprinter that could make living tissue and keep it alive. It was the first of its kind in the world. But just to give you an example of her spirit, when she traveled to San Francisco to give a demonstration on how it worked, this happened. We had the machine on top of the table for demo day, and I was so exhausted that I leaned back on the table and it tilted, and the machine fell on the floor and smashed to pieces. The room went silent. We continued on. I just kicked the machine under the table. It was grand. We came back to Cork and built another machine and went a bit further. She also encouraged women to get involved in STEM. And I think it's a nice way to end my contribution to this session, just with a quote from her in one of her last interviews. She said, "I say, have faith in yourself. Don't get pushed around so much. Show confidence. I also think women should be more supportive of each other instead of being derogatory towards each other, because that's a big problem. It erodes confidence. It's just better to build everybody else's confidence up, because you can build your own that way." So thank you very much, and I will hand you back to Una now.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Clodagh. It was so interesting to hear about some of those women like Gemma, who I'd never come across before. It's brilliant to give them some recognition for their contributions to STEM over the years. So thank you very much for that. I'm so pleased to introduce our second speaker of the morning, who is Dr. Elizabeth Bruton. Liz is the Curator of Technology and Engineering at the Science Museum in London, and she also pens a brilliant blog to the same subject matter. So Liz, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here at the 9th Robert Boyle Summer School. And that was just a superb presentation there, Clodagh. So you've set the bar very high. So I'm going to be giving a brief presentation on the history of women in engineering in Ireland. And I suppose one of the key things that I want to emphasize is that traditionally in the narrative of women in engineering in Ireland and indeed elsewhere, we have this narrative that it starts with the First World War, where men went off to war and their jobs in engineering and technical and other roles were replaced by women, and that's sort of the start. And I want to emphasize that while the First World War had a significant impact on the role of women in engineering and technology in Ireland and indeed elsewhere, that wasn't the foundation, and indeed that there's a longer history of women in engineering in Ireland, in the UK and indeed elsewhere. So the first person I want to look at is Alice Perry, who I'm sure some of you will be familiar with. So she graduated with a first class honours degree in civil engineering from Queen's College Galway, now NUI Galway, in 1906. And she was the first woman in the UK and Ireland, and probably in Europe, to graduate with a degree in engineering. And she's a really fascinating figure. And as you can see, NUI Galway have celebrated her by naming their engineering building after her. So she was born in Galway in 1885, and she came from a family that had a strong engineering and mathematical tradition. So her father, James Perry, was a county surveyor in Galway West, and together with his brother founded the Galway Electric Light Company. Her uncle, John Perry, was a fellow of the Royal Society and was well known for inventing the navigational gyroscope. And as Colin Mulcahy reminded me before this, Alice's aunt, she had two strong female role models as well. So her aunt, Agnes Perry, was a mathematician and was the first Irish woman to study for a degree at Cambridge University's Newnham College in 1883. And it's just worth noting that she studied for a degree, but in fact wasn't awarded her degree because Cambridge didn't award degrees to women until 1948. Additionally, Alice's older sister, Agnes, who was also known as Molly, was the first woman to be awarded an honours degree in mathematics at Queen's College Galway in 1903, so just 3 years before her younger sister got her engineering degree. Alice had initially hoped to follow in her family tradition of studying mathematics, but switched to engineering, and as I said before, in 1906 became the first woman in the UK and Ireland and possibly Europe to be awarded her degree. After graduating, she was appointed temporary county surveyor by Galway County Council in December 1906 in succession to her recently late father, And 6 months later, she was made county surveyor, that's county engineer, the first woman to hold such a role. Unfortunately, her career in engineering was brief. In 1908, Alice and her sisters moved to London, where Alice spent some years working for the Home Office as a lady factory inspector, which involved the monitoring of the laws in relation to the employment of women, particularly in industrial settings. She later married and was widowed during the First World War. And in 1923, she moved to the United States, where she lived out the rest of her life. And as you can see here, the engineering building at NUI Galway is named after her. Then moving on to the Women's Engineering Society, which sort of sits at the heart of this paper. So it was founded in June 1919, and it was founded in the UK, but in fact had international impact in Britain, Ireland, and indeed elsewhere. And it was established in the immediate aftermath of the First World War to try and encourage women to build on the opportunities for women in engineering and technical roles in the workplace, and to continue this into peacetime. And the seven women who signed the Memorandum of Association were Victorian women from various social classes, from landed title holders such as Lady Eleanor Shelley Rolls to former mill workers like Laura Annie Wilson, who counted engineering through a family business or by having the wealth and leisure to try out new technologies. They did not have the opportunity to become independent professional engineers, but were determined to support subsequent generations to have more professional and education engineering opportunities that they themselves had not. The Society's membership spanned the globe, including Ireland, and I've selected a few of the Women's Engineering Society members who worked in Ireland and contributed to their journal, The Women Engineer, as a way of tracing the career of women in engineering in Ireland. And The Women Engineer is fully digitised and available through the IET archives and is a fascinating resource. So first up on the left-hand side, we have Iris Ashley Cummins. She was the first female graduate in engineering at UCC, graduating in 1915, and was also an international hockey player. After graduating, she worked for the Royal Arsenal, with the munitions factory at Woolwich in London, and then the Vickers factory at nearby Erith, as well as a shipyard in Scotland. And that was during the First World War between 1915 and 1916, before returning to Cork. In 1927, she became what was probably the first woman land surveyor employed by the Irish Land Commission, and she worked for the Commission until her retirement in 1954. Also in 1927, she became the first female associate member of the Institution of Civil Engineers of Ireland. And she was also the author of the first article in the very first issue of The Woman Engineer in 1919, writing about her education and training as a civil engineer. And she wrote various articles in the journal about her roles and hoping to encourage women and to follow in her footsteps. Then in the middle, we have German electrical engineer Asta Hamp. So she was the first German member of the Women's Engineering Society. And you might think, okay, where's the connection to Ireland? But she wrote out about her experiences working on equipment developed by the German engineering firm Siemens and Halske for the Shannon hydroelectrification scheme in the 1920s, although there's no evidence to suggest she actually visited Ireland herself. And in 1931, she received her diploma in engineering and had a varied career in physics and statistics, eventually becoming a professor in the late 1960s. And then last and not least, we have Joy Ferguson, who has a slightly more unusual engineering career path. So Ferguson was born in Lurgan, County Armagh in 1915 and became a lady demonstrator in the Electricity Board showrooms, first in Northern Ireland and then in the south of England, while studying electrical engineering part-time, probably at local technical colleges. Then she moved into aeronautics, getting a pilot's license and working for the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and before joining the ATA and conducting over 1,000 flying hours during the Second World War. After the war, Ferguson worked for the Ministry of Supply and was an active member of the Women's Engineering Society. But it's not this that Ferguson might not be best known for, but in 1958, Ferguson came to public attention when newspapers in the UK and around the world announced that Ferguson had had a sex change operation, now referred to as gender reassignment, and had transitioned to Jonathan Ferguson. And in fact, the interesting thing to note is that Ferguson's employers in the civil service were remarkably unconcerned about this. In fact, their only concern was which pay grade Ferguson should be on, whether male or female, and how it affected their pension rights and so on. And with thanks to Dr. Nina Baker for her work on Jonathan Ferguson as well. So the last one is sort of maybe a slight mystery hunt. So this is one of those ones where I'm sort of putting this out to people if they've got any further information. So Irene C. McDowell is a little known independent electricity supplier in Finglas, Dublin. And she supplied electricity for domestic electricity lighting from sometime between 1927/1928 until sometime between 1930 and 1931, when her business was taken over by the Electricity Supply Board, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is the statutory body responsible for electricity supply in the Irish Free State, later the Republic of Ireland, from 1927 onwards. And I came across Mrs. McDowell through the digitised annual reports of the ESB archives, which I can highly recommend as a fascinating source for research. And she was born in Dublin in about 1883. She married Alexander James McDowell, a builder's manager and fellow Methodist, with whom she had a daughter, Vera, in about 1906. McDowell's husband died in their home at Mabel Villa in Finglas in July 1924, leaving Irene with an estate of about £856. At some point between her husband's death in 1924 and the first annual report of the ESB in 1927 and 1928, McDowell began a small independent electricity supply company, generating about 1,900 electrical units annually and providing electricity for domestic lighting to around 4 or 5 customers. So she was one of 15 local electricity suppliers in County Dublin. So they were independent providers that provided electricity to 3 or more customers. And that's basically all that I know. You can see the image on the right-hand side, and that's the house, which is still there. I've gathered all of the information that I have about her on a blog post that I wrote, and I'd really just love to know more. I can't really find out anything about, how did she end up in this sphere? She doesn't have any employers, so it seems to suggest she was running this herself. Is there any family history? So this is sort of, a shout out to try and find out some further information. She was one of 3 female independent electricity suppliers in Ireland at the time, alongside the Convent of Mercy in Ennis, County Clare, which was the biggest supplier of the town. And then a fascinating figure, Ellen Cuff, who was the Countess of Dessart, who was like a Jewish philanthropist, benefactor, and set up an affordable electricity supply company in Kilkenny, amongst contributing massively to the city as well herself. And I think definitely someone worthy of further research. So just to say that this paper has highlighted a small but important selection of women involved in engineering in Ireland, from Alice Perry, the first woman in the UK and Ireland and possibly Europe to be awarded a degree in engineering from NUI Galway in 1906, through to the little known Irene C. McDowell, a pioneer in small scale independent electricity supply in post-independent Ireland, and the role the Women's Engineering Society played in cementing women's entry into engineering and related technical roles in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. The Society's history and membership provided mutually supportive and collaborative opportunities to women of all social classes in engineering, roles previously largely unavailable, especially to those of lower socioeconomic classes. These women, individually and collectively, both members of the Society and women in engineering in Ireland more generally, provide engaging, inspiring role models to women considering beginning or returning to a career in engineering and other innovative fields of STEM. And I've just included some further reading and my email address if anyone wants to get in touch. So thank you very much.
Wow, thanks so much, Liz. That was absolutely fascinating to hear about all those women that are just like selling electricity and doing mad things, and like, as you said, doing things that we thought women didn't do until much later, that they weren't allowed to, and in fact we're doing it. Yep. So brilliant to hear, and I'm sure lots of people will be looking up your blog, and there was actually just a chat there asking if you would paste the link into the chat box so people could
I'll do that.
Have a look at it when we have our break. So thanks a million. I'm going to move ahead on and introduce our 3rd speaker and our final speaker of the first session, if you can believe it, who is Colin Mulcahy. Colin is a UCD graduate, but now Professor of Mathematics at Spelman College in USA. So is coming to us at, I don't know, what time in the morning are you there, Colin? 5 a.m. or so? And Colin, some of you may already know as the curator and creator of the Annals of Irish Mathematics and Mathematicians. So Colin is going to talk us through 150 years of Irish women in maths. So thanks, Colin.
Well, thank you very much. Tá áthas anseo an jobh a Massacórja, and I say that in Irish because a little known fact about Robert Boyle was that he was more fluent in Irish than most of us living today. And if you don't know about that, look. I'm here to talk to you about pioneering women, and that's not a typo. So I'm a mathematician, and over the years, I've become interested in the extraordinary legacy of Irish mathematical women and mathematicians in general. So I'm going to try to do a whiz tour here of 150 years of pioneering women, by which I mean women in Irish mathematics exceeding norms. For the first half century, up to about 100 years ago, women were barely allowed to go to school. As we heard a little earlier, only 37% of girls had a chance to go to school as recently as 100 years ago. And in recent years, obviously, things have improved. Certainly some, if not enough, women have made it to the highest levels of academia here in Ireland and overseas. Before 1970, which is about 50 years ago, we know of about 125 women in total who earn maths degrees or were engaged in mathematical work of some sort. We'll hear about maybe 8 or 9 or 10 of them this morning. The very early ones, of course, were educated privately because there were no secondary schools, and they were for boys only. Even the ones who did excel at university by mastering lectures and passing exams generally didn't graduate. They weren't allowed to. BCD didn't give degrees to women until 1904. And as we heard earlier, Cambridge didn't do so until 1948. Oxford wised up in about 1920. But funnily enough, Oxford doesn't enter into the story of Irish women. So here are some pictures of some famous Irish women. The last 10 or so, 12, 15 of them are alive and well, and going back years. So we'll highlight some of the sheroes here who I think deserve more attention. As we mentioned, if education was off limits to women, academia was even more off limits to women. So a very high proportion of the women before 1920 who were involved in Irish math, whether they were Irish or British, actually ended up as teachers in secondary schools. A couple of the early ones were famous in the field of astronomy, but they generally had to settle for publishing results under their husband's name. And if they did have careers, in most cases, they had to cut them short if married. Now, the information I'm going to share with you and an awful lot more can be found in the online Annals of Irish Mathematicians. It's just a big kind of a database with thousands of people in it. The information in it is spun off into more accessible blogs every month at mathsireland.ie. That's a website I encourage you to take note of. We also tweet at Irish Math Facts as regularly. So since late 2014, 6 or 7 years now, we've been tracking the academic profiles of thousands of Irish or Irish-based people who pursued maths, dating back actually 400 years. Most of them are from the last 200. Trinity introduced the maths degree for men only in 1835. So the concept of studying in maths or getting a degree in maths is fairly recent. We're very broad. We cast a big net, and we include pure and applied maths, maths physics, theoretical physics, astronomy, and statistics, in addition to actuarial science and maths education. We have found over 900 books written by Irish authors, documented off page as well. Now, as I mentioned, graduates in mathematics, male in this case, didn't start until 1835. So the graduates we're tracking, if they did go to university, are basically from the 1800s. The numbers get very large in the last 20 years. We're not quite there yet. But we have a good handle on most grads from the 1800s. We also have a wall calendar, which is not so much a practical thing, but a nice way to take a look at the careers of the people. The most recent one. So there are 28 pages each, and each month we survey 6 people in detail with photos and other things of note, discovery of paternity. We've also made a point of increasing the participation of women in this every year. So how do we get our data? Well, personal contact helps. talk to your old teachers, university teachers, and retired people have incredible memories. They know stuff that people currently active aren't so up to speed on. My tutor website, St Andrews in Scotland, and it's Davis Archive, specifically about women who graduated with degrees in Britain or Ireland up to 1940. The Math Genealogy Project, which is supposed to list every dissertation, PhD dissertation, or doctoral dissertation, it's great, but it doesn't identify people by gender or nationality. Obviously, for modern age, you can look up Siobhan's and Sinead's, and a good chance she might be Irish. You can probably find out. But for people from earlier periods, that's not going to help. Many universities have online search engines. Cork, for instance, has a good search engine. So you can track there. And of course, having some genealogical skills doesn't hurt either. Birth records, death records, registered teacher list, advertisements for previous students as well. Our philosophy is to never turn up an opportunity to report a fact. So just Google mathematics, women, and Longford today. What would you find? I do it myself every so often just to surprise myself. Sometimes I find something I didn't know before. If you get information, process it immediately, share it freely. The database is updated live, and it's on the web the second day. We do have blogs, and the blogs, as I mentioned, well, half of them are actually inspired by Mary Mullen, and that would be inspired by her Atlas of Irish Maths articles online. And I'm not sure if that website's still working, but you have a great website. We actually, Mary and I discussed the months before she got ill the possibility of adding more mathematical people to that. Very interested. Sadly, that did not come to pass. Recently, for instance, we surveyed all the math people here with Tyrone, and Offaly 2 months before that, and Clare 2 months before that. And from the beginning, we have gone out of our way to account for as many women as possible. Some very specific blogs that you might be interested in are early Irish women who got doctorates. Interesting question, who was the first? Or again, in a moment. 3 blogs that address that topic. Now, the Davis Archive, as I mentioned, was put together in the mid-1990s, and it lists all roughly 2,500 women who graduated in mathematics from universities in Britain and Ireland before 1940. The entries are, however, very brief. Here's an Irish entry, Charlotte Wedgwood, and that's all it tells you. Her name, where she graduated from, whether it was BA or BSc, first class, second class, and year. Now, we've gone through all the Irish ones that we know of and tried to find out the life story of those people with some success, although about a quarter of them still remain somewhat elusive. It's a very good database, but not perfect. It did miss a few Galway and Cork graduates. Of course, Irish women who earn degrees from British institutions are going to be hard to spot, because in those days, their name probably wasn't Sinead or Siobhan. It might have been Alice or something that doesn't stand out as Irish. So it's very hard to know if we have found all the Irish women. We know the Cambridge ones and we know the London ones, probably with good certainty. We haven't found any Oxford ones yet. Now, again, in the period up to 1920, we know of 55 such women, grads or equivalent, meaning people who didn't go to university, did but weren't allowed to get degrees. Before 1921, plus 7 British ladies who were called Steamboat Ladies. That was a brief period between 1904 and 1907 when Trinity, having just opened its gates to women, allowed graduates of Cambridge and Oxford to get equivalent degrees from Dublin. And hundreds, I think 700 or something, women did travel over from Britain and get degrees from Trinity, BA or MA, and some of them had earned their degrees a long time before, decades before, halfway through their careers. We know of 7 of those who were mathematical. Of the 55 that we mentioned here, 14 of them did research. That's higher than you might think, higher than I expected. 6 of those were by master's thesis, 3 BAs and 3 BSc. Also a lady who had 1 of each. Of the 55, we know that 22 of them overall got masters, which I think is a higher proportion than for men of the period, not counting the automatic MA that graduates of Trinity were able to get, waiting 3 years and whatever. And I break that 22 down into 6 that were ladies who got Trinity Masters, having already earned degrees in the UK. So 16 of them were for actually Masters by examination, or the 6 above, 10 by examination and 6 by master's thesis. We know that 8 of them taught at the 3rd level, at least for a year. The 2 of them were career academics, and 6 briefly at the 3rd level. Of the 55, we know that 40 of them taught secondary school. That's a pretty remarkable statistic. They weren't just getting these degrees as a trophy. They went out and did something with it. So far, we're very, very fortunate to secure photographs of 18 of them, and we think 2 more might be on the way. We keep going through the family trees to try to find grandchildren, great-grandchildren, somebody who might have a photograph. And we're hoping to fill in more. Interestingly, 27 of them out of the 55, that's to say half, were associated with Ulster. Belfast, or they went to university in Belfast, or they were from the northern Ulster counties. For what it's worth, 26 of them are known to have married. And that's something to bear in mind, because as we said, most who married had to terminate their career. 1 or 2 of them had husbands who died young, and they managed to get back to work afterwards. So let's look at 5 women from before 1921. The first one is Mary Clark from Cork. Her brother and her sister were both in the same line of academia, as in her sister also wrote about astronomy, as Mary did, and her brother also had a maths degree. He was educated privately, but did achieve a high level of competence in mathematics and astronomy. Published extensively, writing numerous popular articles, books on the history of astronomy, and contributing to the Encyclopedia Britannica on lives of astronomers and mathematicians. She died very early in 1907. Sophie Bryant, who was born in Dublin and was one of the first people to graduate from the University of London, which offered degrees to people in the early 1880s. Got a BSc first class honors in what's now called philosophy, was mental and moral science, and a second class honor degree in mathematics. Did a doctorate, not in mathematics, but was the first woman in Britain or Ireland to do it. But significantly, she was the first woman in the world to have a paper published in the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society. That was in 1885. So she was publishing mathematics that early. Alice Boole, very famous parents. George Boole, who was from Lincolnshire, first maths professor at Cork. And she was brought up in a household where, although her father had passed away when she was very young, her mother was very interested in mathematics and pedagogy. And she, in the 1880s, was given a problem to consider about 4-dimensional shapes and managed to rediscover 6 4-dimensional versions of things like hydra, and so on. I coined the term polytope, that's where the word comes from, and higher dimensional versions of these, and contributed several chapters to a book written by a relative of hers in 1888. Also published many papers and was given an honorary doctorate by university in 1914, and worked with the famous geometer Coxeter in the 1930s, an incredible lifespan of 80 years, active right up. Alice Everett, whose father was himself a physicist, mathematician combination, was brought up in Belfast. She'd been born in Glasgow. Studied maths at Queen's College there and at Girton College, one of the 2 women's colleges at Cambridge. However, she wasn't allowed to get a degree from there, so she was given a degree and a bachelor's and master's by the Royal University of Ireland, which became NUI in 1908. She worked for the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, being the first woman paid to work there. She later did research in optics and the engineering of early television of career. Annie Monder was born in Strabane, also educated at Girton, and was the highest ranked mathematical student in the BA examination. Also ranked second class honours when compared with all of the men. But as a woman, of course, wasn't allowed to get a degree. She was famous for her research on the sun and sunspots, published for decades at Greenwich. Had to settle again for publishing her findings on her husband's. So that's 5 sheroes from before 1921. Now, from 1921 to 1970, things changed dramatically. A lot more women were attending university in Dublin, Galway, Cork, and in the case of mathematics, not so much at Cork. I'm sorry, Belfast, Galway, and Dublin, and not so much. Here's somebody that we only found out about maybe a year and a half ago, Margaret Coughlan from Wexford. And, she finished school with the nuns in Wexford, and then at the age of 17 or 18, sailed to Texas with a plan, which she followed through on to become a nun. And in between her duties, she attended Catholic University in DC, 3 installments, took breaks in between, and got a PhD in 1931 in algebra. This makes her indisputably the first Irish woman to get a PhD in pure mathematics. Very interestingly, her doctoral advisor was Aubrey Landry, and he's also famous for being the advisor of the first African-American woman mathematician in mathematics. Marjorie Loftus. Now, she did secondary school in Ireland and did her university training in America. She taught at Incarnate Word College in San Antonio until 1943, and I'm told for health reasons, she then quit teaching and worked for 2 decades as an accountant in Fort Worth. And we don't have a photograph of her yet. And look, she died in 1983. There must be letters home to Wexford. Somebody in Wexford who remembers her, cousin, descendant of a cousin. We've got to get a photograph of her, but we do have her tombstone. Muriel Kennett was born in Belfast to 2 Belfast parents. For reasons that are unclear, we haven't traced the father's demise. Her mother moved to Canada very soon thereafter, within a year or 2, and remarried a man called Wales. So Muriel was brought up Muriel Wales. And she had Irish genes all the way and was educated at the University of British Columbia and the University of Toronto. And doctoral degree there in the early 1941, I think. Most of the 40s working in atomic energy in Canada, and then seems to have retired, worked in real estate, I believe. I'd only just. This is the most famous Irish woman in mathematical science. She taught me at UCD back in the late 1970s. Sheila Tinney. All of her mathematical achievements were achieved long before she married, when she was Sheila Power. Her father was professor of maths at Galway. So she had that influence in her life. She was educated largely at UCD after a year at Galway, and then at the University of Edinburgh. 2 years after getting her master's in Dublin, Max Bourne was the first Irish woman who university level education in Ireland. She had a doctorate in mathematical sciences, mathematical physics, pure mathematics. She was one of the first 3 scholars appointed at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies in 1941. Spent most of her career at UCD and rising to the level of associate professor. Her son Hugh Tinney, by the way, is at the penis of summer now. Barbara Yates was born in Dublin, grew up in Belfast after partition. Her family included a father, an uncle, and 2 brothers, all of whom were Trinity scholars. She was a Trinity scholar, but she's the only one who kept going in mathematics. And she got her PhD from Aberdeen in 1952. Having done her bachelor's Trinity, this makes her the first woman, 3rd level, to get a doctorate in pure mathematics, 1952. She spent her whole career following. And finally, from this period, Siobhan OShea, who again had all of her mathematical credentials, including her doctorate, well under her belt before her marriage, which was in 1970. History remembers her as Siobhan Vernon. She's from Macroom in Cork. She was educated all the way at UCC, where she taught for over 30 years. Only the second woman math science grad in UCC, the first one 4 years earlier in 1948. So UCC was late to the party for mathematics and women. Her PhD was also from Cork. It was in 1964. So she's the first Irish woman to get a PhD in pure mathematics from an Irish institution. However, it was for a collection of previously published papers. Anything about it other than that it wasn't traditional working with an advisor for 3 years or 5 years doing new research. The first Irish woman to have that distinction at Irish University in the 1970s. Now, what happened from 1970 on, the last half century? Well, very gradually, more and more women started playing fuller roles in academia and elsewhere, for instance, industry and government, both in Ireland and abroad. For those at universities, this includes publishing papers, getting grants, and supervising postgrad research and postdoc research. And to a lesser extent, editing, authoring books, being in editorial boards, and serving in leadership roles. I mentioned earlier that we do know of 900 books written by Irish authors or written by people while working in Ireland, mathematically. To be honest, very few of those were written by Ireland, disproportionately very few. So that change has become. Pauline Mellon from Avoca in Wicklow, who was entirely educated at UCD, is an analyst and was the first woman to supervise a pure maths doctorate in Ireland, and that was mathematically in 1999. He recently served a 2-year term as the president of the Irish Mathematics Society. I'm going to tell you a little bit on the next slide about other people who've been recently promoted in academia, but there's a big question here which I am not qualified to answer. I think a lot more evidence needs to be gathered before we can answer it, but it needs to be asked. Is women's work being adequately rewarded and recognized? There are some encouraging signs. DIT, now TUD, Trinity, Limerick, and Galway have had a woman serve as head of relevant department or school. And I didn't mention the others because they haven't. Women at the highest 2 ranks of professor, you might call them professor level A and B, traditionally associate professor or professor, but some institutions have different categories. So at the highest 2 grades, Sally McLean at Coleraine in Ulster University, who has a statistics background and has supervised over 40 doctorates in statistics and informatics. Sarah McMurray, theoretical physics, Trinity, now retired. Del Marshall, statistician at Queen's in Belfast, operations research as well, has supervised many PhDs. Catherine Comiskey at Trinity in the School of Nursing has supervised many PhDs. Natalie Kopteva at Limerick in applied math. Another one at Limerick is Sarah Mitchell in applied, who's the chair there. Neil Ryan, theoretical physics at Trinity, and Anne O'Shea at Maynooth. And I haven't included observational astronomers who there's a number of those who've achieved high-ranked women in Ireland also. And of course, overseas, we could broaden the horizons here. And time is coming to an end. So let's move on. Here are some congratulations from the last year. Very recently promoted since last summer, the highest ranking professor at the institution. Actually, from Belfast, who is now full professor at Galway. And just this spring, Claire Gormley at UCD in statistics and Norma Bargery in Limerick, also statistics. Just a few days ago, this came across my horizon. Emily Cannon, who's currently studying for a PhD in Belgium, has just become the second author on astronomical breakthrough paper with content, which just appeared in Nature this week. And she's an astrophysics graduate. So I think it's safe to say that a brighter future lies ahead. More and more women are going to be trained in mathematics, entering research and other careers. We're going to talk briefly about those in a moment. We'll continue to exceed norms. So our focus has been on teaching, research, and academia. Of course, training in maths has always been excellent preparation for a wide variety of careers for women and men alike. Irish Mathsy women have pursued careers in the Central Statistics Office and its Northern Irish equivalent, in industry, in the actuarial world, in finance, and many other arenas. Here are some women who have doctorates in mathematics or applied mathematics, or theoretical physics. 2 of the 4 women we know of with doctorates at the Met Éireann have mathematical or Mathsy doctorates. In fact, there are, I think, 6 or 7 women with maths background. Sarah Gallagher and Sandra Spillane are 2 examples, and looking much further afield and nowhere near mathematics, Ellen Joyce, the finance editor of The Economist, and Sandra Collins, the director of the National Library of Ireland, both have mathematics or applied mathematics. So we could broaden the picture here and talk about, amazing careers that women have had with maths backgrounds that aren't in academia. Big thanks to the Davis Archive and AEL Davis, with whom I corresponded a few years ago, 2015, I think, when we got started on this. I was saddened to discover when I Googled yesterday that she passed away last year, born the same year as my own mother. Her groundbreaking work really has helped enormously, and I think one day it will be nice to have all of her Irish maths women who got degrees up to 1940 documented on a single web page with pictures. If anybody would like to assist with that, I encourage you. Olivia Bree at St. Patrick's from Condra, and Elizabeth Olsen at Trinity, and David Malone, Nuth, Mary Killeen, UCD, and David Thurman at Trinity are just some of the other people who've helped a lot with this project, and especially the women angle in the past several years. And I'd really like to thank Robert Boyle Summer School organizers for the opportunity to speak here today. As I mentioned briefly early on, Mary Mulcahy and I did briefly correspond in the months before she became ill and sadly passed away. So this is definitely dedicated to her memory. She was a pioneering historian of STEM heritage and a champion of women of note. And it's great to see so many people working to continue that legacy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Colin. It was a very comprehensive overview of women in mathematics. I think it's brilliant to be able to get to touch on so many brilliant women. And as you said, there's a few caveats there. We can go, the spider web can go much further than we're even able to touch on briefly this morning. And that's really, really brilliant to hear, I think. So thank you very much for that, and for keeping such a brilliant record of all these women. And to Claude and Liz for the same, keeping a record of these women so we can keep their memory and their contributions and their pioneering contributions alive and well. So thank you very much to all our speakers this morning.